Hi, we'll start the webinar in a few seconds. We'll wait for everyone to join us. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Melinda Huntley. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Travel Association, and I welcome you to Ohio, Funding Your Future. A little bit of background on how this conversation, this webinar was started. I've known John for years. John has worked with DMOs for over, 20 years, John, specifically on funding challenges. And I had the good fortune of attending a webinar recently where the Funding Futures report that was developed by Miles, Civitas, and Tourism Economics was shared. And I thought, boy, this is really great information, timely information for our DMOs in Ohio. And so I reached out to John to see if he would be willing to share this information with you. Little did we know, even last week, what was happening in last week. As many of you know, we have lost one of our colleagues. The Bowling Green Visitors Bureau funding was pulled, and they moved that function to the chamber. So we kind of knew we needed to have this conversation. I think we have to have this conversation even more so now than we ever have before. So please put questions you have throughout the presentation in the Q&A or chat box at the bottom. John and Tiffany have agreed to field your questions following the webinar. We will also send a recording to you, and I hope you've had a chance to read the Funding Futures report that we provided as a link to you prior. So joining us this afternoon is John Lambeth. He is the founder and CEO of Civitas, and he is an expert in really developing unique funding strategies for tourism and travel promotion. Tiffany Gallagher is the East Coast branch manager, and she has a long history in the hotel business. So she brings a completely different perspective. Both are attorneys, both are coming at this issue from an entirely different point of view. And I think we need to listen to all points of view and, really examine all opportunities open to us as we go forward. So I'm going to turn things over to John and Tiffany. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Melinda, for that kind introduction, and thank you for having us on your webinar today. First, I want to say congratulations to you and Ohio Travel Association. I know you are so focused on providing education to all of your members, and I know you do that on a regular basis. Today is just one more step of that, so congratulations on that great work on behalf of the DMOs throughout Ohio. Tiffany and I are really excited today to be sharing this new study that was just recently released with you. And this screen shows you some of our topics we're going to cover today. We're going to give you an overview of the report and talk about some of the key findings of the report and also sharing some of the recommendation. We're highlighting some of those things from the report. Then I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany, and she's going to talk a little bit about the question we get asked the most about, which relates to Tourism Recovery Improvement District. So she's going to talk a little bit about that, and we've saved some time for Q&A so we can do a bit of a deeper dive. Well, this study originally was born out of a discussion that Miles and I started pre-COVID. We started talking about doing some studies internationally. We were looking at doing some work for New Zealand on looking at international funding structures for DMOs across the globe. And we had started down that path when COVID hit, and like so many well-laid plans, COVID diverted us from that task. So we put that on pause, but it wasn't very long into COVID that we said, you know, what DMOs really could use is a palette of choices. They could use information about what funding sources are out there, what are some opportunities, what kinds of things should they be looking at for their future funding. And so we came up with this report. It started small and it grew and grew and grew, and it really came into something that is providing an awful lot of information about funding out there. In fact, I would venture to say it's the most comprehensive DMO funding study that's been done to date. We have some terrific partners on that. I mentioned Miles. Tourism Economics did a significant section on this as well. We're going to be covering some of the highlights from Adam Sachs and his crew and the forecasting work that they did. And in addition, U.S. Travel Association, the Destinations Council, helped sponsor this effort. Destination Analyst was helpful, as was Destinations International, and not last but not least, the Destination Marketing Association of Canada, DMAC, also helped sponsor our efforts. So what was it? What did we do as part of this study? One of the things we did was update a study we did a few years ago with U.S. Travel. We had looked at tax rates around the U.S. We really started the very first benchmarking of tax rates so that we could see what was happening to taxes both on hotels and F&B, and how were those taxes changing over time. That was a tax study we released 2.5 years ago. We used the same metrics, we studied the same destinations, and we have an update and now a benchmark as it relates to those. We did focus groups with both at the state level, the provincial level, as well as local DMOs to get their feedback on funding, their funding challenges, their funding outlooks. We did a survey of DMOs and state travel offices. We updated some state travel funding information that was available, as well as Canadian funding information on a provincial level. I mentioned Tourism Economics did an outlook, an economic forecast as part of this, and it is the most recent of their forecasts presented yet. We had 10 funding options that we put forward in the report, and 10 recommendations for action. This is a long report. I think, set out thinking this might be 20 or 30 pages. It's 125 pages in all of its glory. You can get it free on our website at civitasadvisors.com. There's a link specifically to the future funding study, and you can click on that to get that. On today's webinar, we're going to be covering 6 of the enhanced funding options and 3 of the recommendations that we provided in the report. We sort of tried to tailor it to the ones that we thought would be most helpful to all of you. In particular now, I'm going to delve into the research and the survey work that we did. I mentioned that we looked again at tax rates. And what we found, we were quite surprised. In our study from 2.5 years ago, we studied 100 destinations. We looked at the same 100 destinations. 25 out of the 100 had actually raised their tax rates. So a full quarter of the destinations had raised their tax rates anywhere from 0.15% to 2% over that 2-year period. In bigger cities, the average hotel rate all in rose from 15.4 to 15.9%. So the average amongst larger cities, the average amongst all cities was 14.9. Amongst larger cities, it was 15.9. So you can see in larger cities, we are really at that 16% level in terms of an average. And that means that we're talking to a lot of cities that are in the 17, 18, even 19% range that are bringing that average up, as well as those that are below the 16% mark. So really, we're seeing quite a range. And as we all would expect, we're seeing those rates go up. We also broke it into regional basis. We've got this all broken down in the report if you want to see more detail about how this breaks out. But in particular, the Southwest of all the regions across the country had the highest rates. We did a survey of DMOs, and we got what we felt was a very good response. We got about 120 responses from DMOs giving us information about their funding, their budgets, what was happening with them. And I've picked out some of the key ones to share with you today. In particular, of course, we were interested in what sort of reduction on average have you seen in your budgets, and amongst US DMOs, that was 35.7, and in Canada, slightly higher at 41% average reduction. We also asked them what types of funding they have. And this is skewed a little bit for local DMOs in that we had state travel offices in the mix, but you can see obviously the number one hit in terms of most common funding that 45% of the respondents had was advertising revenue. Tourism improvement districts or marketing districts was pretty high at 30%. You can see the city municipal government funding at 30%. That's in part due, we would think that number would be much higher, and we know that local DMOs, that number is much higher. That's in part due to those places that their local funding flows through the state, number one, or number two was state travel offices that don't receive any of that funding, and that's why that number came up so low. But you can see others are receiving money through their short-term rentals and a variety of other sources in terms of the funding mix of the DMOs. One of the other really interesting components of this too, when we talk about funding, and especially in a COVID era, we hear a lot about DMOs rethinking their mission, rethinking their structure, rethinking their positioning of the DMO. And so we asked this question, essentially, are you looking at, number one, an increased role in destination management? And you can see amongst US DMOs, that number was very high, 72%. And also an increased role in economic development. And that number I thought was quite high, even at the 55.8%. And so there is a linkage here between what you do and how you fund what you do. And so we're always looking at the mix of the structure of the DMO and how that relates to the most successful funding mechanisms that folks can put together. Of course, we asked the question about looking at more sustainable sources of funding. We know funding was a big topic pre-COVID, obviously post-COVID. It's a huge issue for DMOs across the country. And so we're not surprised that over 70% said, yes, we need to look at more sustainable sources of funding for our industry. Turning now to tourism economics work and Adam Sachs, they really did a fantastic job of looking at several things. And I know many of you have seen their numbers in the past. One of the numbers they look at is room demand. And this slide is their projection of room demand. You can see they've got room demand coming back fairly quickly through the end of 2020 and into 2021, recovering at a fairly healthy pace, that 80–90% level into 2021. And this reflects actually a downgrade because of some of their initial assumptions about the virus and certainly the lengthening of the virus. They've now sort of backed off of that a little bit, but you can see into 2021 that a lot of the room demand has recovered based on their projections, not getting to full recovery out until further into 2022 on room demand. And of course, room rate, as we know, is another story. It takes ADR longer to come back. And they're really showing those numbers coming back to 2019 levels in 2024. So they have revised some of their numbers down, but really that's sort of what we're looking at in terms of their projections based on assumptions around the virus and sort of the lingering impact to the travel and tourism economy and where they see that resurgence coming, and really based on experience with a lot of other downturns and looking at what's likely to happen as we start to recover through this process. Probably most importantly, they also looked at the specific room revenues or the specific revenues that various DMOs rely upon. So they looked at hotel room revenue and looked at state and local government revenue and said, how quickly do we think these numbers are coming back? And you can see the decrease in hotel room revenue was sharper than it is in the overall state and local government revenue picture because there are so many other sources of revenue there. But you can also see that the growth coming out of this is much slower on the state and local government revenue than it is out of hotel room revenue. So much quicker projections in terms of increases year over year, 40% in 2021, 27% in 2022 on the hotel room revenue side. Okay, funding options. We put forward 10 funding options as part of this, and we went back and forth a lot as we did more research, as we did more surveys, as we did more focus groups. We got more ideas and more thoughts, and we tried to build these into these 10 categories. And one, of course, was recovery and stimulus spending. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. Building reserves, really important going forward. Can't overstate that, right? We all know that. We've known for a long time it's critically important to our industry. We never saw something quite like this coming, but those folks that had significant reserves are in a far different place today than those that didn't. So how do we, over a long term, look at doing that, bringing that back? How can we share risk through insurance vehicles? We talked about the role, responsibility, and structure of DMOs and revisiting that issue. We talked about the evolution of dedicated funding. We're going to talk about that a bit here. Tax increment funding. I know many of you are familiar with it. Your state travel office was funded through a tax increment funding model, and there are others like that out there. Private co-op funding, short-term rental revenue, and finally, we did look at a couple of regenerative funding models, either outcome-based funding or specifically regenerative models, and I'll talk about those as well today. So first on recovery, these are things hopefully all of you know very well and are familiar with, whether it's Coronavirus Relief Fund, and I understand that there have been DMOs in Ohio that have done well with this. There are, across the US, there are many DMOs now that have got these coronavirus relief funds. These are the federal government money that was passed down to the states and the larger cities and counties so that that money could be pushed out. It's discretionary at the local level, and a lot of DMOs have been in those battles and gotten that money, and that's all recent. So we're hearing, even as late as last week, I've heard about some of those allocations coming. So hopefully you all are familiar with those in your communities and are working your best to get some of that money. EDA grants, we've been on the forefront of this. We've helped a lot of DMOs through the EDA grant process. It's not an easy process. The EDA is not used to funding tourism and travel, but they are going to be doing it. There are going to be bureaus that receive EDA grant funds for planning, for strategic work, for economic analysis, for a whole host of things that the EDA has greenlighted as part of the EDA program. Employee retention tax credit, a few folks have gone for that. The EIDL, you're familiar with that, is the loan program, has a $10,000 grant if you have 10 employees on the front end of it. PPP, obviously most DMOs haven't been able to go after because it was not available to C6s. However, we're hoping that that's coming. And what we're advising folks as it relates to the PPP is if you haven't dealt with your bank yet on this issue, this is funded through private lenders. If you haven't dealt with your bank, if you haven't done your paperwork, if you haven't gotten all those records together, please do it. So that you can be on the front end of this. When the feds act, we anticipate that the program will be rolled out very quickly, and those in the front of the line will do much better than those that start preparing for that later. We've also seen other local discretionary grants. We've seen quite a few bureaus go to their cities and counties and say, we need extra money. Of course, it's a very difficult time to be asking for money since their budgets are hit hard, but in a few circumstances, bureaus have been successful at doing that. So as much difficulty is out there right now as it relates to funding and budgets and the like, there's also an opportunity. And one opportunity that we've seen in the COVID area relates to asking for policy decisions that don't require funding behind them. So our elected and appointed officials, they know our industry has been devastated. They know DMOs have been devastated. And in almost every case, they want to try to help us. But in many cases, they don't have funding to give us extra funding to help restore our budgets. It's a great time to be asking for policy decisions that may not have a price tag attached to them. And one of those would be in the area of reserves. So we've talked to lots of DMOs around the country about their reserves, and we've talked to DMOs that have had no reserves, that have been relying on general fund money, that have said to us, we're required to give back any money we don't spend at the end of the year, to others on the other end of the spectrum that have done a fantastic job with reserves. Like Kevin Keane in Memphis has significant reserves. He's really worked hard at building up that structure and building up those programs over time. Now is a good time, if you don't have a good reserve policy, to be talking to folks about a new reserve policy. Even if you don't have the dollars today to fund it, getting the policy approved is a very wise thing to do now to help you over time. Hard to have a discussion about funding without talking about short-term rental issues. This is a question we get asked frequently about should they be a part of funding? How can they be a part of funding? And really, there are three primary issues when it comes to this topic. Obviously, one is the permitting. We see a wide variety of permitting or prohibition of short-term rentals around the country. Second is, how are they taxed? Are they taxed through the bed tax or not? And are they taxed through other mechanisms? If you have an assessment mechanism, are they assessed? Are they paying other fees that are associated with this? And finally, of course, enforcement. And so we've written a chapter in the study here about specifically looking at this. We're working with several bureaus now that are focused on gaining short-term rental revenue in one of these three phases, either looking at the permitting, looking at how those taxes and the rules around the taxes specifically are structured, or third, looking at enforcement. Okay, evolution of dedicated funding. This is a topic that Tiffany's going to talk more about. I'll just touch on it briefly. I think all of you know tourism improvement districts, which are assessment models, were started way back in 1990. So we have almost a 30-year track record now of these districts. There are a lot of them around the country, about 200 of these districts around the country, and now in 17 states. Mobile was one of the latest states on this. What we've seen those evolve into are several things. One is we're seeing culinary districts. Starting about 10 years ago, we saw an emergence of districts around restaurants and including restaurants in districts. Now, that's not easy. It's difficult getting restaurants on board, understanding the value proposition that you're offering them is a key part of that. But we certainly have seen communities be successful at putting together those districts that assess restaurants and then spend the money for the benefit of those restaurants. And it could be anything from marketing and advertising to events to bringing in customers from out of town. There are a whole wide variety of things that the restaurants have found value in out of those. A few of the tourism improvement districts have expanded their footprint, right? We talk a lot about sort of diversifying your revenue streams. Some have included attractions, restaurants, car rental, etc. So we've got some experience with those. And right now in the hopper, we've got two new kinds of districts that are on the books, are working their way through the process. And there are a couple of wine marketing districts where they're working with tasting rooms on putting together something very much like a tourism improvement district. And we are in California, of course, crazy California. We're working on our first cannabis improvement district. And I'm actually thinking that should be Cannabis Benefit District, or CBD would be a better name for that one. But we are going to get that done in the next few months. What we've seen since COVID is a shifting of the nomenclature and the description away from tourism improvement district. And folks now have talked about self-help tourism recovery districts or tourism recovery and improvement districts. Tiffany's going to talk to you more about that with a little deeper dive in just a moment. And finally, I want to mention tax increment financing. You all are familiar with this. This is the concept of pledging future increases in sales tax growth. It is identifying a baseline of the sales tax revenue that's coming in and saying everything above that baseline up to a certain amount will be dedicated back into tourism. I know at the state travel office level, you had a $10 million cap on that number. There are other states that don't have caps that remain true to that formula. And I think this is a mechanism that we're going to start seeing more of. It doesn't involve a new levy. Nobody pays anything extra. It doesn't take away from existing funding. It simply says a portion of future increases of funding will be dedicated back to tourism. And you can imagine why this is attractive to our leaders, right? There's no need to raise taxes on anybody. You're not taking anybody's current money. And it really is about encouraging the tourism industry to grow the tourism economy and then benefiting from their activities. Finally, outcome-based or regenerative models. Really, this is looking at something that really had been gaining steam prior to COVID, which is looking at the balancing of tourism and the environment, right? We talk a lot in the tourism industry about sustainability and what can we do to mitigate impacts of tourism. So in some places, they have explored differential fees. So incentivizing or disincentivizing travel, either in certain places or at certain time periods. It might be demand-based pricing for those fees. And finally, looking at reinvestments back into the environment. And so we've got several folks that have built funding models around those. You can see a lot of this really came out of some of the European destinations originally, but we're starting to see more and more of these regenerative models surfacing in the US. Okay, I want to leave you with a few key recommendations before I turn it over to Tiffany. And of course, then we'll have questions at the end. But these were a few that we picked out that we thought would be most helpful to you. And this one may sound obvious, but the reason I've included this in here, that is, make sure you've exhausted every option to secure stimulus funding, is because we talk to DMOs all the time that have thought they exhausted it, and through the course of conversations discovered, no, there is still another opportunity for them. There is still another pot of money out there that they haven't gone after. There's still something else to do. So if you haven't looked at all these options that we've covered today, then certainly either feel free to ask us, send us an email. We'll be happy to share information with you, talk to others, find out opportunities for going after this. Some of these are not easy. Some of them take a lot of time and effort, and I'm thinking about EDA applications and the like. They really take persistence. So don't be deterred, stay after it. Those folks that are, I think, are going to see the greatest rewards from a lot of this stimulus funding that is out there. Something else we've talked to folks a lot is really trying to strengthen the predictability of the revenues, right? COVID was a disaster unlike any other. We saw such a sharp, steep decline in revenues, particularly from the hospitality industry, that we're now looking for ways, how can we look at predictability and mitigating risk into their future? One of the concepts that came up was this rolling average concept. There are a few bureaus out there that instead of getting paid based on collections this year, or even collections last year, we know there are many in both of those camps, that it's a rolling average over 3 years. And what that does is it sort of cuts the top off the peaks and cuts the bottom off the valleys so that your funding is much more stable, much more reliable. And as we have these peaks and valleys in our economy, in our funding sources, a system like that worked through with local government really has a way of strengthening the predictability of it. One other advice we give the DMOs often is make sure you understand what are the limitations and political risks around your current funding models. So often DMOs get surprised because something has gone on for years. They think it's stable because of the length of time. And really when they delve down into it, find out that a simple vote of the city council, a vote of the state legislature, some other political change can essentially change their funding that they thought was very stable. So getting a handle around those risks, really understanding your funding sources, and then working on ways to mitigate that risk are all recommendations that we included in this report. And how could we do this report without recommending exploring additional funding streams? It's a call we get on a daily basis. How can we raise more money? And so we have looked at everything from tourism recovery districts to the sales increment financing. I mentioned the short-term rental revenue and regenerative models. These are all things that are out there on the table. There are all things that DMOs can look at. You know, and I'll tell you one other, I'll share this with you. We've been really surprised at the reaction of our business partners since COVID hit. I think a lot of folks say to us, hey, how could hotels, for example, ever want to do more funding? Well, I think a lot of hotels are in survival mode. We know they are. And it's a very, very difficult time for them. And many of them will say, we're not going to think about any of this. But there are a lot of hotels that are right now thinking about recovery and saying, how do we do our best in recovery? How do we make sure we have the resources? We know destinations that are well-funded and move quickly are going to outperform others in the recovery process. And the hotels know that. Their marketing and sales departments have been slashed. And so they're more reliant on the DMO's efforts than ever. And so we've actually had not only around the country, but even in Ohio, we've had hotels reach out to us and say, look, we want to do something that will give us money and give us adequate resources so that we can adequately compete in recovery mode. And so we've been pleasantly surprised by the business community and the hotels and others stepping forward to say, we need something like this to help us through the process. And so with that, I will like to introduce Tiffany. We were very, very lucky when Tiffany agreed to join our firm. As Melinda mentioned, she has over 20 years experience in the hotel business and really brings that hotel perspective to the work she does. And I'm really, really pleased she was able to join us to present a few slides with us this afternoon. Tiffany?
Tiffany, you're
I
muted.
think you're on mute. I think she's on mute.
I had to get my controls back. Sorry about that. That's why I couldn't. Okay, one more time. Thank you.
Hey.
Thanks, everyone. So thank you, John, for the introduction. Thank you, Melinda. As John mentioned and Melinda mentioned, I spent most of my career in the hotel business. I actually was introduced to this model, this mechanism, when I was serving as a general manager in Syracuse, New York, is where I live, and I work out of on the East Coast for John's firm. We were in a position in Syracuse. I was on the board of the DMO at the time, where we were experiencing an increase in supply, and we had stagnant demand, and that's a story that I know many of you relate to. So we were looking for supplemental funding options. We had an allocation of our bed tax, which remained also pretty even year over year, although our expenses and competitiveness were increasing. And so this model was very attractive to us. I'd like to talk a bit about how it works. It's a small charge that is assessed on hotel businesses, which is then passed on to the customer. It looks a lot like bed tax on a room folio. It's a line item on the room folio. It's then collected similarly to bed tax by your local government, and they're remitted back to the DMO to manage those funds. The pros of this mechanism is that it creates a level playing field. It is a compulsory model, which means that once it is approved by the payers, the hotels in the district, it is compulsory. So it is not optional. So everyone involved has to pay. Everyone in the destination has to pay just for the period of time that is agreed to. It is transparent. So again, it's something that's visible to the customer. It's something that the government has to approve. And it is also obviously hotel approved as well. It is reliable. So you know that you have this revenue stream for the term of the district, which is different than your typical bed tax model. Year over year, you may not know exactly what you'll be allocated or what you'll receive. In this model, for the term of the district, 5 years, 10 years at the outset, you can plan for your collections based on the plan that's put together by the destination. Again, it is a pass-through to the customer. Some cons that we highlight: it is government involved, so we do involve the government in this process, and the reason why is because we do, the government creates a level of oversight and transparency that is comforting to not only the payers, but to the local government. There are some regulatory requirements, so depending on where you are, we'll talk a bit more about Ohio specifically in a minute, but there are some kind of rules around forming these districts, and the government may want to collect a fee for the collection mechanism, and then also the government serves as the regulator of that as well. So they will also enforce the collection on your behalf. I'm going to press this forward button and see, there we go. Very good. A common concern that we have from DMOs and from hotels is, will we keep our existing funding? So if we put in a new funding source or mechanism, will the local government see this as new money and either reduce or remove altogether existing funding models. And so this has been a concern since the beginning, since 1990 with the first formation. And of course, we have 180 districts now. Of course, the hotels and destinations would not have moved forward with that had they not had assurances around keeping their existing funding. And so baseline provisions are implemented in each funding structure, which allows for the baseline funding, so your existing funding, to be kept at an agreed level. I'd like to highlight, I also mention this when I'm speaking to hotels and to destinations when we're learning about this, that you don't necessarily have that protection today. Implementing a TID is a legal process which requires a formation ordinance. The baseline protection for existing funding is part of that legal formation, which is a protection that most of the time does not exist today. Some private organizations have chosen to return funds for other purposes to free themselves of allocations. We don't see this often. Most of the time, destinations want to retain their existing baseline funding, and they also feel strongly that if that levy is on their businesses, that those businesses receive some benefit for that. However, in some cases, we have seen destinations return that funding back to the local government in order to have a private mechanism that they can manage and control themselves. TRIDs have led to widespread significant budget increases. On average, we've seen most destinations nearly double their income for destination marketing efforts. Some national statistics that I'd like to review with you. We have 180 districts in the country. John mentioned 17 states now. Most recently, Mobile, Alabama formed their district in May of 2020. This is significant. It really was the only TID to form during the formal government shutdown. And so this was a hearing that we were able to attend via Zoom. I think maybe the only formation hearing we did via Zoom ever at that point. And in the 17 states, we have 56% of our districts using a gross room revenue percentage as the methodology for the assessment. What that means is it's a percentage of room sales, so 1%, 2%. And we have 44% using a fixed dollar amount. $1 per occupied room, $2 per occupied room, et cetera. There really is no rule on this, by the way. It is really just based on what your destination feels is best for them. For example, Philadelphia has a 0.75% TID, which generates about $7 million a year pre-COVID. And we also have Newport, Rhode Island with $1 per occupied room generating around $400,000 a year for their TID. On the low end, we have one district raising $10,000 annually. That district is comprised of one hotel. And on the high side, we have a district raising $41 million a year. That is San Diego, California. That is also an example of a district that has renounced public funding, as a side note. These are the 17 states that have active districts. And these are the states that are either in formation today or are seriously considering formation. You'll notice that Ohio is lit up yellow. Some characteristics of recovery districts. John mentioned that the TID is evolving and with the pandemic and the existing environment. There's been an evolution of this concept. And so the first thing I'll note is that with these districts, they are, we call them self-help districts also. So we're not asking the local governments to give us any more money. And we know that our local governments don't have the resources that they once had as a result of the pandemic. And so with these districts, we're really just asking for our local governments to support and give us a policy decision to allow us to help ourselves. It is scalable. So what that means is that assessment methodology I was referencing before, either dollar per occupied room or percentage, can be scaled based on a number of factors. So it can begin at a particular rate and scale through the term to a different rate if that's what your destination deems most acceptable. So that can also be tethered to occupancy rates. So if we wanted to start a district at a smaller rate, and as you hit thresholds of occupancy rates, then you could escalate that percentage or dollar per occupied room. These districts allow you to build a reserve. This is a public-private partnership. These funds are not divertible. Therefore, they are protected and can be kept in reserve for future uses. Assessments cannot start prior to a specific date or occupancy. So an element of these plans can be to identify a begin date. So you could begin, you could actually form a district and not actually impose the fee until a later date. You could tie that to either a date or a particular occupancy, as I mentioned before. Also, formation costs for these districts are reimbursable from the district revenues. And so that can be paid back to the entities, plural, that have kind of put money together in order to put a district together. There is a required plan with these districts. The recovery plan, some elements require the funds to be managed by the destination marketing organization, and that is by way of generally a committee of hoteliers that are a recommending body to the destination marketing organization that in turn executes the plan that is passed by the hotels in the formation process. It requires the funds to be spent in accordance with the recovery plan. So if the spend of the funds proposed is not in line with the plan that was approved by the hotels, then that money cannot be spent with lodging businesses oversight. Collection and districts do not last forever. We mentioned this before. There's a defined term at the outset, typically 5 or 10 years. And that's specifically outlined and approved by the hotels in the formation process. At the end of that term, if the hotels choose not to continue with the district simply goes away at the end of that term. If they'd like to renew the district, typically formation would follow the same process, renewal would follow the same process as formation. So how do we do this in Ohio? We have been fortunate to work with some of your DMOs to do some really good legal research in respect to tourism improvement districts in Ohio. We may not have mentioned this, but Ohio does not have an existing TID or TRID, although we have several destinations that are really interested in the mechanism. And so we typically look at a couple of paths legally when we're entering into a new state. The first being, is there existing legal authority to form an assessment district like the one that we've described? And second, is there the ability to write a local law that would allow us to form a district that would suit our needs? And so we've looked at both of these paths. We've identified that the existing assessment law in Ohio, while it has some good elements, doesn't really have all of the optimal elements that we think are necessary to do a tourism improvement district in a way that would best benefit our industry. And so we turned and looked closer at the home rule option. The Ohio State Constitution does grant the authority to cities and towns to legislate on matters of local concern, specifically the ability to levy benefit fees in particular. So we found that positive. We also, that's not our opinion solely. We did work with local attorneys in Ohio to vet that and do have agreement on that. This offers the most flexibility in defining the district parameters in the formation procedures. This essentially allows us to draft a law from the ground up with your guidance. It allows us to draft the specific requirements around the structure of the district, also specific to the approval procedures required to form. It allows for a standalone TRID, so that is, it can be a separate mechanism from the existing bed tax mechanism, and can be implemented locally without additional state approval. I think it's important to mention this would not require an approval from the state legislature. This would be done locally in your local cities and towns. So once we are moved through the initial legal process with the city, we would work with your destination to form a steering committee. The steering committee is generally comprised of hoteliers that represent a good cross-section of the leadership and demographic of your destination. So leadership of size of business and geography of your destination. From there, we work with that steering committee to identify the structure of the potential district. And once we've done that, we bring that out to the community for feedback. So we reach out to the stakeholders that would be potentially involved, and then we receive that feedback and ultimately tweak that plan to a point where we feel like we have the vast majority of the destinations supporting that plan. We then move through drafting that district plan and through an approval process. That approval process would be dictated by that draft law that I mentioned. So I don't have the exact parameters for that because that would be decided essentially by you and your stakeholders. Once we've met the thresholds of that structure through the law that was passed, we would then move through the city council or town hearing and approval processes to actually form the district. Thereafter, the levy would begin in accordance with the plan that was approved by the stakeholders. John, I might ask you to talk a bit about Memphis, just because Memphis, I think you had, unfortunately I wasn't involved in this particular formation, but I know it's very successful and it's unique in nature. And so if you don't mind, John, I have to give you back remote control, don't I? I should have thought about that. There you go.
There we go. Thank you, Tiffany. And I'll just very quickly, so we can get to questions here. I will mention, we wanted to share just a couple of case studies with you. One, of course, was Kevin Kane in Memphis. And in fact, we did this under the Home Rule Authority in Tennessee. Essentially, they knew that their budget was going to be diverted, a significant portion of their budget, and they were going from a $9.5 million down to 6.6. We helped them put together a TID, which raised an additional 5.3. They were able to leverage that into an additional county match. And actually now their budget is north of 15 million overall. Another thing that we look at is how much marketing dollars does a destination have per available room? That's MPAR. And you can see they're at $617. We see a lot of destinations in the $300 to $350 range. Some higher end boutique destinations might be north of this, but that's a very significant number. Kevin Kane there has really identified this as a key factor for Memphis's success pre-COVID, and into the COVID era, it really helped him with his reserves as well. And so this is he's somebody, if you're interested and you know him, he's a great person to talk to about his experiences and how that worked for him in Memphis. And then Tiffany, did you want to talk about Philadelphia?
I'd love to, actually. Philadelphia, I was, when we formed Philadelphia, I had 16 hours earlier, we had formed the district in Newport and drove pretty much overnight to Philadelphia to be there at a 10 a.m. hearing. It was a really great day. This is a particularly unique formation because it's really one of the only districts in the country that was formed specifically for group room night generation activities. And so this levy was put in place just to incentivize group business. It is also uniquely, has a unique hotel board that takes a look at each piece of business that it incentivizes, and that board recommends an ROI of 8-to-1. I mentioned earlier it's a 0.75% assessment fee on a daily rate. $5.6 million collected in their first year. They were able to fund 92 large conventions and events, and resulting in $1.6 billion in economic impact. This says they were already looking at getting reauthorized beyond the initial 5-year period. They actually have renewed their district, and they did that 3 years into their first term because it was so successful.
And so with that, again, this is where you can get a copy of the report at www.civitasadvisors.com. And there is a specific link to the study on the homepage. So please feel free to look that up and grab your copy of that report. And Melinda, we'll turn it back over to you to answer any questions that folks have.
Fabulous. Thank you. We do have some questions, and I recommend everybody go to the bottom of the screen. You can submit through the Q&A or the chat function, whichever you prefer. Can you talk a little bit about, one of the questions came in, can the tourism recovery districts include restaurants and retail? And we're going to take this question. There's a lot of questions in one group, so I'm going to go one at a time.
And the answer to that is yes, Melinda. We've had districts that have included restaurants, retail, hotels, although I will tell you that that can be difficult. Anytime you go across industries, it makes it a more difficult process, but there are plenty of examples. Mammoth Lakes is a good example that has restaurant, retail, in addition to lodging involved. Our statewide district that funds our state travel office in California includes all of those plus car rental. So there are opportunities for that. And it's certainly something that our clients generally explore.
Do the stakeholders still have to vote and have a majority in order to get to city council? And could this be done on a county level?
Yes, to county level. In fact, most of our districts are county level. Some are multiple cities, some even are multiple counties, some are one city. It really is a very flexible mechanism that way. I'm sorry, what was your other question?
Do the stakeholders still have to vote and have a majority?
Sorry.
Okay.
Yes, and we want that to be the case, because part of this is to make sure that this is a protected mechanism. We want the legal protection of the benefit fee like Tiffany talked about, but we also want this to be seen politically as an industry mechanism. And I tell the story, a few years back, our then Governor Jerry Brown was at a dinner, and he basically was this fiscal hawk that didn't want to fund tourism. And he said, you know, when I was governor last time, you were always coming to me asking for money, and I'm glad you figured out how to raise your own money. And he was talking about the statewide district that funds Visit California. He saw that not as the government's money, but as the industry's money. And that's a very important concept around these. And part of that is getting the industry to support. So when we do a home rule district like Tiffany talked about, we can build in the support structure that you want. It can be a 30% petition. It could be a 50% petition. It could be a balloting. It could be a protest procedure. There's no limit in terms of how you do it, but typically we want some kind of industry approval for the mechanism.
Very good, thank you. Could you talk about the terms? What are some of the options as far as the terms? 5 years, I think you talked about Memphis. They renewed in 3. Can you go 10 years? I mean, what is the average? What do you see as the average? And also, what do you see as the variables that might dictate that term?
You know, when we first started doing these districts, it was very common for them to set up for 5 years. They were new, they were unknown territory, and both the stakeholders and the local government liked the idea of having a shorter term. Now, over time, we've seen them, particularly upon renewal, go longer. So a lot of districts are going 10 years. They still want that accountability feature. They still want to be able to tell the stakeholders and the city that this is not going to go on forever, that this is going to have a checkpoint, that we're going to be held accountable for results, but that we need a longer time. And in fact, now we've seen some districts go 30 years and even 40 years. And so there is this tendency as districts mature to go a longer period of time. But again, under home rule, it's really up to you for how long you want to set that term.
Awesome. So looking at those that have been the most successful, what characteristics or, you know, actions, or I don't even really know what specifically I'm asking, other than there's got to be some commonalities between those that have done really, really well and those that not so much. And what are some of those commonalities that you've seen?
You know, that's a great question, and maybe Tiffany will want to weigh in on this one too, but there's two different elements of success, right? One is success of the programs, and the other is the success of the financing. Because I get often asked, how successful are TIDs? And I say, they're 100% successful, because their job is to raise the money, and that's what they do 100% of the time. The question really often comes down to, are the programs successful? And that doesn't matter whether the money's coming from the TID or bed tax or some other grant. That really relates to, are the programs that the Bureau is doing getting them the results that they want? And so what we do see is a heightened level of accountability, typically with these districts. We do see more tracking of KPIs and more adjustments. So the districts overall have been very, very successful. The renewal rate is above 95% for the districts. So that tells you the stakeholders, the cities, the counties are saying, yes, we like these are working. The question is really, what are the programs that are working? And you all on the call know way more about that than Tiffany and I do. That's your expertise, not ours. But we do find bureaus really, really carefully using this money, putting resources into tracking and making sure they get a real solid bang for the buck. Tiffany, any other observations you have about what's worked well and what hasn't?
I think what's notable, I mean, I think you're right, John. It really is about programs, how it's put together. But what's notable to me, and coming from kind of, the hotel side, is sometimes, it's not always the case, but sometimes there is a bit of disconnection between the hotel community, the business community, and the DMO. And, the engagement is either very kind of cyclical, and really the relationship isn't fantastic when it comes to that. The formation process really engages that, and really the only way you can form a district is to have the hotels and the DMO work together, put a plan together, and pass it. And so because of that, with everyone at the table post-formation, you're able to put together programs that are almost guaranteed to work because you've got everyone working towards the same goal.
Thank you. No, that's a solid answer. We're in the process of recording our learning modules for our Spirit of Ohio event, which is kind of an educational event. But one of the modules we're doing is key performance indicators and how those have changed. And this conversation directly aligns with what they're going to hear in that module. And I think your report even addresses. Can you just speak a little bit to the work of DMOs and how it's essential that we, take a look at the work they're doing, but it's more about how they talk about their work and why this is important in any of these funding mechanisms, whether you're going after CRF or, any of these other elements, not just recovery districts.
Well, that's an excellent question, Melinda, and it's one that I know is on a lot of people's minds. And I will tell you, I think the work that Destinations International and Jack Johnson and his team has done over the last few years has been truly outstanding in this space, really sort of shifting the thinking away. And we've talked a lot, right, about what does the M stand for in DMO? Is it marketing? Is it management? Or do we just call ourselves destination organizations, right? But I think that there has been a real awareness that our destination organizations over time do better when they think about a much broader role than simply tourism and think about, as DI would say, their shared community values. What is it that we are doing for our communities? Because DMOs do so much for the community. They do a lot for jobs to put people to work in the community. We do a lot for tax revenues to fund sorely needed public projects. We do a lot to bring amenities to our communities, not just for the visitors, but for the locals. And so thinking about these shared community values, as DI says, I think is a very strong thing for destination organizations to be thinking about. And taking that one step further, then thinking about who are those partners that should be sitting around the table. We know the hotels and restaurants and other hospitality partners need to be there, but what about the universities? What about the hospitals? What about the corporate leaders? Are there things that we're working on as DMOs that bring benefit to all those folks? You bet there are. And can we start to talk to them about how we fit into that picture and ultimately look for funding from some of those other partners as well? But in the near term, really talking about what are our shared values? What are those things that we all want to do? And how can the DMO be a driving force around getting success on those issues?
And what better time to have those conversations than now?
Oh, I mean, it's why we included it in the report. It's why we want to talk about it. We think DMOs should be talking about it and thinking about it. It is topical, it is timely. And like I said, if there are policy decisions now, if there are questions about what your role is, what your reserves should be, about the way things work, now really is an opportune time to be asking for things. If we need local government approval for something, it's a very good time, especially if it doesn't involve writing a check, to be saying to them, you may not be able to write us a check, but help us here. We need some help on this policy. And we're seeing that work in community after community. I can't tell you, Melinda, how many times I've seen a local government since COVID hit do things that they would not have done 6 months ago. And it is an opportunity in this terrible crisis. And I'm hoping folks can think of ways to help their own bureau by taking advantage of some of those policy decisions, teeing them up now and getting an affirmative vote on them right now while the political opportunity is there.
I totally agree. We have one community, just as an example, talk about a creative and leveraging what they do well, leveraging their expertise. They ended up getting some of the CRF funding through an agreement with the city because they were sharing the mask wearing policies because the DMO has marketing expertise. So they developed a relationship with the city council, said, look, and here was a bureau, they didn't have the people back at work. They had one person, everyone else had been furloughed. And they were able to bring back people to help the city with this responsibility. It's not going to last forever, but the reality is they're making those relationships, they're showing their worth, and they're able to bring people back to work and to keep going on their mission. So, it is about looking at your expertise, your skills, what you do, what you can deliver, but it's also about understanding the issues that your stakeholders have right now and how can you help them address their problems.
Aren't those great stories? And doesn't it make you so proud to be in this industry? I think DMOs have stepped up like never before in this crisis. And we just see them every day doing amazing things in the community. And it's so heartening to see and so wonderful and presents such a great opportunity, just as you've highlighted.
Yes, it's amazing. One last question, unless there are others. Last call for questions. So I have, this is just a little pet peeve of mine. So I have been, in this industry for way too long to state. And, I guess it's coming into this role because I had worked for an attraction, a DMO, even academia within the tourism realm. But I found in this role, I had more responsiveness when I talked about travel and not necessarily tourism. Because tourism is met with a different response by those who aren't in the industry. And I think we always have to consider perception, no matter what we do. And I'm just curious if you ever run into that when you're, particularly now when we're talking about, tourism recovery districts or tourism improvement districts, there are people out there who have their own perception of what tourism is. It's very hard to change. Right. And so just wondered if just the vernacular had ever been talked about or you'd ever run across that.
Well, certainly we've run across the issue of the word travel versus tourism. And we certainly, oftentimes when people say, well, there's no tourism here, really what they're talking about is, right, leisure tourism. We say, even if you don't have tourism, you have travel. Right? Everybody has travel. So it's a very good point, but I haven't actually heard it raised in the context of our districts. We haven't had anybody say we're going to be a travel improvement district, but they certainly could be. I mean, there isn't any reason. It's really up to you as to how you position it. And I think you're right, Melinda, the optics are important. The nomenclature is important. And certainly if somebody wanted and thought the use of the word travel would be superior, they certainly could do that.
If that works, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think there are any other questions. I want to thank you, John and Tiffany. Lots of great information. You have your, let's see, I have all these different quick Q&A boxes open. Yes, you have your website. So it's civitasadvisors.com. And you mentioned the future fundings report. The one I have is about 45 pages. Is that the one that's available?
It should be a total of 125 pages with everything on there.
Okay.
with all the
Okay.
pieces. That should be what's on the website. I'll double check it, but I believe it's
Okay.
our 125-page report.
Okay, perfect. Because it looks like I have maybe the abridged edition. So
That's just the executive summary.
I guess so, 45 pages. So yes, if you can just let me know, and I will send the link out when we send this recording, just so they can have access to the full report. I thank you very much. Good luck. You have their emails, you guys. So any other questions, reach out to the two of them or reach out to us. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you for having us.
You're welcome.